Alright, we're going to go about 24, 25 questions here. We're on 11 on section 2. Number 11 says, which of the following be example of an intermediate good? Remember, intermediate goods don't count in GDP, only the final good or service. Alright, because, think about it, intermediate goods are the goods that you produce on the way to producing something else. Like all the paper has been produced, and then it's used to produce a book. So the paper is an intermediate good. The book is the final good, as long as it's used for its final, consumed by the final user. Why wouldn't you count the paper? Well, the cost of the paper is included when the person buys the book. And if you counted the paper and the price of the book, you'd be double counting the paper. So you don't include intermediate goods. You need to know that. Don't include them in GDP, and then you need to know what they are and what a final good is. Final good is it's used by the consumer or the person who needs it for its final use. Right here, a calculator purchased by a college student for taking exams, that's its final use. Gasoline purchased by an insurance agent to visit clients. So what does she produce? She produces insurance salesmanship. The gasoline used to produce that is an intermediate good, and its price will be built into her cost. So gasoline is an intermediate good, and the answer is B. A house purchased by a family of 4 children, that's a final good. They're using it for its final purpose. A car purchased by a student's parents to give them to the student so he can drive it around is a final good. And tuition paid by a student at State University, the actual service of the education will be a final service. I don't know what the tuition will be classified as. That's not really a good or service. 12. Best example of structural unemployment. Again, the type of unemployment where the structure of the economy doesn't fit your skills. So I'm looking for somebody who doesn't have a job because they have the wrong skills. Probably because technology has made their skills obsolete. Computer programmer quits their job to move to a warmer climate. They're not even unemployed. They don't want a job. Construction worker who loses his job in the winter, that's seasonal unemployment. It's obviously seasonal unemployment. Very rarely are there questions where the answer is seasonal unemployment because that's too easy. An auto worker loses her job during a recession. No, what kind of unemployment is that if during the recession part of the business cycle you lose your job? Because there's not enough demand for goods and services for you to have a job. That's cyclical. A steel worker is replaced by a robot. That person has the wrong skills. Alright, technology has caused their skills to be obsolete. Maybe there's a job out there doing something else. In that case, it'd be structural unemployment. Toy maker who sued a company that closed because its consumers did not buy its toys. What kind of unemployment is that? Where there's not enough demand for your good, so you lose your job? You can't find one somewhere else because not enough demand, aggregate demand. That would be cyclical unemployment. Not enough aggregate demand means it's a recession. Okay. All right, now we jump into some questions about price indexes, about inflation, and about nominal and real. I think there's some nominal real questions on this one. So let's jump over here and remind ourselves what price indices are and how do you calculate inflation when you have them. Price indices, price indexes, are a picture of what the price index is like in one year versus another year versus another. They're all in terms of base year. All right, base year the price index is 100. So if this year the price index is 200, that means the prices are twice what they were in the base year. If this year the price index is 80, that means price indexes the price levels are 80% of what they were in the base year. Now they don't typically, price indexes are not all goods and all services in the whole economy. Because they don't represent all the prices of all goods and all services because that's impossible to calculate. So what they do is they pick a basket of goods and services that represents what they're after. If they're concerned about the prices faced by consumers, so they want to build a consumer price index, they use a basket of goods that a typical consumer buys. If they're worried about the prices faced by producers, they use a basket of goods that a typical producer buys. They go what's called the producer price index. So we don't use that much. Producer price index shows how price changes faced by producers. Well, it shows price changes faced by producers. That typically reflects the price changes that are going to be faced by consumers. Right? And then we also have the GDP price index, which is a different basket of goods. It's a basket of goods typical of the goods in a GDP, and it is used to deflate GDPs when GDPs are nominal and we want to make them real. Sometimes it's called the GDP deflator. Alright, so regardless of your price index, how do you use it to calculate inflation? Well, inflation, one way to define it, you can define it as increases in the general price level. You can define it as a decrease in the purchasing power of of the money in a system. Or you can define it as percent change in the price index. You say, what's the price index used to be? What is it now? What's the percent change? That's the inflation between those two periods. So, do anybody remember how to do percent change? If inflation is the percent change in the price index, you do percent change is change as a percent of the old. Alright? It's change as a percent of the old. It's change over old. Alright? Or, some people like to say, well, it's new minus old. New minus old. That's change, right? New minus old. That's change. Over old. And then, of course, you got to go times 100% to make it into a percentage. And if we're doing inflation, it's percent change in the price index. So, new price index minus old price index over old price index. There you go. That's how you do inflation. You don't have a calculator, so the number should be plain enough and easy enough that we don't need a calculator. Okay? And then you use price indices. And the main way we use price indices is either this, or you can use the magic formula to change nominal to real, which is nominal over real equals price index over 100. Okay? And that always works. Don't use some other formula you find some review book, because whatever it is, if it's not this, it's lame. That's the best one. Now, this will convert, for example, nominal GDP to real GDP, in which case I'd probably use the GDP price index. It's called the GDP deflator sometimes. Deflator. Right? It'll convert nominal wages to real wages. In which case, then I'd be thinking about somebody earning a wage. That's a consumer, so I'd use the consumer price index. Just pick an appropriate price index. Okay? So let's see what the answers to these problems are. All right. Oh, and by the way, one more thing. The only exception to that equation over there is interest rates. That's not how you convert nominal interest rates to real interest rates. If it becomes interest rates, it's nominal interest rates equal to real interest rate plus expected inflation. Plus expected inflation. So it has its own special formula, but it's not till later in the review. That's called the Fisher equation right there, but the AP test doesn't typically want you to call it that. They don't, I don't know if that's something they expect you to know. Alright, so number 13 says that the price index of in a country were 100 for year 2000. What does that mean about 2000? The price index is 100. The base year. And 120 for 2003. Nominal GDP in 2003 were 480. Then gross GDP for 2003 and $2,000. Remember, that's what you're doing when you're converting nominal to real. Nominal is in its own year dollars. And nominal is not that useful because we can't compare $2013 to $2012 to $2005 to $2,000. Nominal is in its own year dollars, and it's not that useful. Real has been converted to a common dollar so we can compare them. We factored out inflation. All right? And the common dollar is the base year dollars. All right, that's why they say at the bottom, what would happen if you made it real GDP for 2003? And they go ahead and say, by the way, that would be in $2,000 and year $2,000 because we converted it to base year dollars. All right, so let's use the magic formula. Let me make sure we can see it on the camera. Yep, we got room right here to write nominal over real equals price index over 100. And then we start filling in blanks. There should be one of these that we don't fill in. It'll be our unknown. All right, so let's see. The price index is 120 for 2003. It says it's 100 for the base year, but we already knew that, and it's already filled in our equation. What's the nominal in 2003? That's 480. So I want the real. So what's the real? I mean, you just cross multiply. 480 times 100 is 480 with two zeros equals 120 times whatever the real is. I'll use R. Use X or whatever I want to. Divide by 120 on both sides. And you get R equals, oh good, they gave me easy numbers. Zeros cancel. 4,800 divided by 12 is 4,000. Nope. It's 400. So C, about $400 billion. It's not just about $400 billion. It is $400 billion. All right, let's go to the next one. 14. Hey, nominal over real equals price index over 100. That'll answer this question for me. All right, let's see. So they gave me, this is kind of a weird chart, but okay, it's fine. Look, they said, okay, let's imagine the GDP deflator with 1990 equal to 100. That'd be 1990 as a base year. Okay? So it would be 100 in 1990 and 200 in 2000. And in this column, they said, okay, now change your mind and make 2000 your base year, and then we'll fill that in a second, but they don't answer that yet. The value of the gross domestic product in 2000, in terms of 1990 prices, what are they asking for, nominal or real? If they say, hey, we want it in base year dollars. We're asking for real. Okay? So, what's the real in 2000? Well, there's the nominal. Nominal over real. Price index over 100. It's the same problem. It's the exact same problem. There's the nominal in 2000. 1200. Now I know I'm using this column because 1990, I want to convert to 1990 prices. $1990. I want 1990 to be the base year. The price index for the year 2000 is 200. And, ooh, this one's easy. 2 over 1 is 1200 over 600, right? I mean, this reduces to 2. What would go right here to make this reduce to 2? It's got to be 600. So the answer is A. You could cross multiply it out if you really want to. In 2000 were made the base year, like in that last column, for the GDP deflator index. The value of the index for 1990, rounded to the nearest whole number, would be, now my instincts on this one told me 50. Alright, but it actually turned out not to be true if you go ahead and work it out. My instincts told me 50 because I was like, oh, 200 over 100, 100 over 50. That's not the formula. It's not price index over price index equals price index over price index. It's nominal over real equals price index over 100. So, let's do this. All right. So, let's write the formula down. Nominal over real equals price index over 100. And they said, okay, if 2000 were made the base year, the value of the index for 1990, round to the nearest whole number, would be. Okay, so I need the price index for 1990. That's my unknown. What's the nominal for 1990? 500. But that's in 1990 dollars, and we want it to be in year 2000 dollars. What is the real amount for 1990 after it gets converted? This one's really hard. Well, it requires an extra step. Well, what happens? Let's use this column. What? Okay, I made a mistake here. Hold on. 2000 were made the base year. GDP price index. Value of the index for 1990, rounded to the nearest whole number, would be. I made a mistake. What mistake did I make? Oh, I know what I want to do. I need this to be. How did I do this? I did this earlier today, and I was just like, oh yeah, that's pretty easy. Now I know the answer is B. What? That doesn't follow my nominal over real. That's a different formula. That's why I don't expect this to be on the AP test. It doesn't follow my formula. That's the nominal from 1990, right? Yeah. Is this the real from 1990? No. That's the nominal and the real from 2000. All right. What did I do wrong?
If 2000 is a base year, wouldn't that be the real?
No. Because that's the 2000. That's an amount from 2000.
Oh, but it's made a base year.
Well,
wouldn't you need the price index to find the real?
that is. Yeah. Here's another way you can do it. Let me show you how else you can do it. All right. It's not going to be very satisfying, but another way you can do it is to say the price index is definitely not 0. All right. It's definitely not higher than. In fact, I bet that's what they expect us to do on this problem. But definitely not higher, right, The price index for 1990 is definitely not higher. It's got to be lower. Even if we rescale 2000 to the base year, 1990 has to have a lower price index, because it always will. Well, eliminate all the ones that are higher, it's got to be 42. I guess that's what they meant you to do. They don't put that sort of thing on the AP test. My formula gets you by all the AP test ones. Sorry that I gave you one that was too hard. Alright, the CPI tends to overstate true changes in the cost of living for the following reasons. Now this might be a little advanced too. In other words, changes in the cost of living just means price level changes. How much it costs to live, price level changes. And CPI is supposed to measure inflation, price level changes. Well, it may overstate the problem because people make little adjustments to avoid inflation. If the price of apples goes up, they buy oranges instead. I think that one's on here. That's too advanced for the AP test, though. Consumers change their purchase patterns. All right, what about the first one, though? So I'm going to mark out any one without a 2 in it. There we go. The index does not take into account changing quality. That's true. In other words, the price of a computer is what they use, and a computer's different today than it will be in 10 years from now. So it tends to overstate changes in the cost of living because you may be able to buy the same thing for a cheaper cost in the future. So I like both 1 and 2. The CPI includes only domestically produced goods. That's not true. It's a typically bought market basket of goods from anywhere. And consumers often buy at discount rather than retail. I don't even know what that means. So I put 1 and 2 on this. One above it's really bothering me. It works if you put 500 over 1200. Whatever.
It's like a proportion.
It is, but it doesn't follow my formula. And I only want you to worry about my formula. Which of the following is true about the natural rate of unemployment? It's 3 to 5%. It is structural plus frictional. It means no cyclical. All right. So it can vary over time. I think it maybe can, but nobody ever told me that, so I'm not going to put that. It is 2% or less of the civilian labor force. No, it's 3 to 5%. It's equal to the structural employment rate. No, remember it's structural and frictional. It allows for some frictional and cyclical unemployment. No, it doesn't include cyclical. Only includes structural and frictional. It is the full employment rate minus the cyclical unemployment rate. All right. Well, first of all, I want to put this because I want to imagine that they wrote a good question. This is not a good way to say this. Let's say total. Instead of saying full, let's say total. Without this change, I might go back and put A, but I'm going to change that to total. It is the total employment rate minus the cyclical. By the way, it can vary over time. I think they want me to put A in terms of just our ability to prepare for the AP test. Let's pretend that A's not on there because that just doesn't help us with anything. It is the total employment rate. Let's say total unemployment rate. The total unemployment rate minus the cyclical unemployment rate. Would that be the true of the NRU? Take the total unemployment, take out the cyclical, and you have the NRU left? Yeah, I like that. I like that version of the question better. So let's use that. Alright. I gotta see. Suppose a factory added $5,000 worth of... Well, I like this one too. This one's clever. Suppose a factory added $5,000 worth of output this year. In other words, they produced $5,000 worth of goods and services. Does that count as GDP? They produced $5,000 worth, even if it's just added to their inventories. Changes in inventories count in GDP. Incidentally, the waste from this factory caused $1,000 worth of loss to the neighboring waterways. They want you to do, okay, 5,000 minus 1,000 in loss is 4,000. They want you to do that. What's wrong? The answer is 5,000. The answer is straight up A. Why don't we include that $1,000 in pollution? You factor in things like losses in inventories, depreciation. No, you don't. You don't factor out depreciation first. Look, is there anything being bought or sold when that pollution goes into the water? Do we really know? I mean, does anybody report, hey, $1,000 in loss? No. GDP is the total value of all goods and services produced in a given year. He's right. We don't factor in some sort of loss from pollution into a river. Pollution is unaccounted for in GDP. So GDP can understate how well off we are if it fails to include lots of production that happens and it doesn't include people mowing their own yard or selling things on Craigslist that never get reported. But it can overstate how well off we are if it fails to factor in things like, well, more production can mean more pollution. Okay? Or people don't have as much leisure time or something. And make us look better off than we really are. Which of the following is true if real GDP in year 1 is 5,000 and year 2 is 5,200? I think this one's like a super basic percent change question. How much percent change was there? New minus old over old. So new minus old, in the most recent year minus the one before that, is 200. And then over old is 5,000. Does anybody know what 200 over 5,000 is? Cancel a 0, cancel a 0. What's 2 over 50? That's 4%, right? Output is increased by 4%. Yay. It's not inflation because this is not prices going up. This is how much we're producing. This doesn't look like a recession to me if output's going up 4%. Looks like it's economic growth. All right. And then when the actual inflation rate is greater than the anticipated inflation rate, that's a good question. Who wins? Okay. If nobody ever made any adjustments for inflation, who does inflation help and who's inflation hurt? I don't know. I really think through that literally every time. I know it's either loaners or borrowers. So I think to myself, well, suppose I loaned somebody $100 and then time went by and they paid me back $100 because I failed to adjust for inflation. Oh man, they just paid me back with weaker dollars, with dollars that have been weakened by inflation. So I lost. I loaned them strong dollars, they paid me back with weaker dollars. They won though. They got to borrow strong $100. Time went by. They paid me back with a weak $100. So loaners lose and borrowers win from inflation. There's a couple of words for loaners and borrowers you need to know. A loaner can also be called a creditor, and a borrower can also be called a debtor. So there you go. And then also, for example, people on fixed incomes where their income doesn't change. Obviously, inflation hurts them because if you get paid $1,000 a month, that $1,000 is worth less and less and less. Most of the time, though, people with fixed incomes are given some sort of inflation adjustment called the cost of living adjustment. Okay, so in that case, in theory, they avoid the problem with inflation. Their fixed income gets bumped up. It's not really fixed. Final question is, how do banks know about inflation? And do loaners usually know about inflation? And do they charge you for inflation? If loaners are hurt by inflation, do banks charge for it? Of course. If they want to earn some real interest rate, they'll add in an inflation premium, which is expected inflation. Expected or anticipated is what this question says. They'll guess what they think inflation will be and charge you for it. All right? And what do you call that amount? When they take how much they want, the interest rate they want, which is a real interest rate, so they can be a business, buy food, plus charge you for inflation, the fact that they're just hurt by inflation and you're helped. What's the outcome called? The nominal interest rate. If they ask you to define the nominal interest rate on the AP test, put it's the real interest rate plus inflation, or inflation rate. If they ask you to find the real interest rate, say it's the nominal interest rate minus the inflation rate. Okay? The interesting thing is, what if they guess wrong? Well, if they guess and charge you too much, you lose. And they win. They get extra money. If they guess and charge you not enough, you win, because they didn't charge you enough for inflation. All right. The borrower, if you're the borrower. Okay, so anyway, let's answer the question. When the actual inflation rate is greater than the anticipated inflation rate. So let me put some numbers on this so I can process it. They anticipated inflation, let's say, to be 3%, and the actual inflation rate was 5%. They didn't charge you enough. The loaner loses. The borrower wins. He gets to pay back weaker dollars. Okay? So, who suffers? So I'm looking for the loaner. Let's see if they're on here. Those who lend at a fixed interest rate. Those guys. Fixed meaning it doesn't change. Some people loan at variable interest rates, but that's beyond this course. Those who borrow will actually win. Retired persons with cost of living adjustments are fine because the cost of living adjustment changes with inflation. Sometimes called a COLA, C-O-L-A, cost of living adjustment. Employers who hire workers with long-term labor contracts, oh wait a minute, do they suffer? You got to pay your workers the same even though prices are going up? No, it's good for the employer. Who suffers there? The employee. Because they have this long-term contract and they're getting the same amount of money and prices are going up. Well, how would we say that in economics terms? Prices are going up, and yet I'm still getting paid the same amount. The amount you actually get paid is called your nominal wage. But the one that reflects price, that sort of has inflation accounted for, is called real wage. So what's happening to your nominal wage? Well, it's the same. You're getting paid the same. What's happening to your real wage, though, if you're going to facing higher prices? Your real wage, how well off you are, is actually falling. You're facing higher prices with the same nominal wage. And in those who lend with flexible interest rates, that's beyond the scope of this course, they would just adjust their interest rates for the higher inflation. All right, let's jump over to we'll go to about question number 15 on number 3. All right, cool. Aggregates. This is the real course, right? Aggregate supply and aggregate demand. It's good stuff. All right, the first few questions are real straightforward. Which of the following is aggregate supply? It is all the supply put together, and supply is producers' willingness and ability to supply, to produce. So, it's certainly not buyers. Is it a schedule showing the relationship between inputs and outputs? Maybe. I mean, I kind of maybe want to put that. Let me see if there's something better. If there's something better, I'm going to put it. Schedule showing the trade-off between inflation and unemployment. That's not it. Did anybody remember what that's called? The graph, it's this downward sloping graph that shows the trade-off between inflation and unemployment, or controlling inflation, controlling unemployment. What? That's producing, that's production. It's the Phillips curve. It's a short-run Phillips curve. But we'll get to that later. A schedule indicating the level of real output that will be purchased at each possible price level? No, because what's that? Purchased. That sounds like aggregate demand. I liked everything else about it. It does relate, aggregate supply does relate output, which we usually write GDP, and price level, each possible price level, but purchase is aggregate demand. Aggregate supply, which we usually draw like that, or I pretty much had you guys draw it as a diagonal like that. We zoomed in on the intermediate part. Is a schedule indicating the level of real output that will be produced. That supply is production. People who make the stuff at each price level. So that one's E. All right, a change in which of the following called aggregate demand curve to shift. So you need to know the determinants of aggregate demand. All right, I know them. There's 4 of them. What are they? What are the things that shift aggregate demand? In fact, if you move your aggregate demand curve on the free response, you don't just need to move it. You need to show why you moved it, and showing what these 4 things will explain why. C, I, G, or X. If you move an aggregate demand curve, you need to explain this moved because of either C, I, G, or X. Now, each has subdeterminants that are kind of hard to remember for some people, but they all make logical sense if they're presented to you on the paper. Ooh, run low on batteries. We'll see if we can finish up here. All right. Remember, consumption is determined by, that's consumer spending, so it's determined by the taxes consumers face. And just to make sense, more taxes they consume less, and less taxes they consume more. It's determined by just their total wealth. If they have more to fall back on, they tend to spend more of their income. If they have less to fall back on, they tend to spend less of their income. It's determined by their expectations, although that's hard to test. And there's one more: taxes, wealth, expectations, and their all right, now. They're richer, they'll spend more, or they'll spend less. Okay? Investment, gross private domestic investment, business spending is based on 2 basic things. This one's easy. If it's good for business, they tend to invest more. If it's bad for business, they tend to invest less. But basically, it's determined by the rate of return. Sometimes I abbreviated this with lowercase r in class, but it looks like the AP test wants lowercase r to be the real interest rate. Whatever. It's determined by the benefit of investment. The benefit of building a new factory or machine is some sort of rate of return. I'll earn 6% return on my investment. All right. The cost, this is the benefit, the cost of investment is the interest rate. So we get this relationship. Less interest rate means more investment. More interest rate means less investment. Probably the most important thing to remember to answer a lot of these questions. Okay. Determinants of government spending is Congress, because that's all at Congress. The determinants of exports and imports are more complicated, and we'll wait until later on those. It's things like the exchange rate and stuff. All right. So which of these shift the aggregate demand curve? Energy prices? No, that's supply, isn't it? The determinants of supply are basically good for business or bad for business. Anything that makes it easier to make stuff or harder to make stuff. Well, higher or lower energy prices is a supply factor. Like higher oil prices will cause businesses to supply less because they can't afford all that expensive oil. All right. Productivity rates, again, that's a supply factor. All right, that has to do with production. It doesn't have anything to do with demanding goods and services. Consumer wealth, that shifts the C. That's just aggregate demand curve because of C. All right. The price of inputs, again, that's a supply side thing. That's the cost of resources. And then prices of consumer goods. That's on an axis, right? And the price level is on the axis, so that's a move along or not a shifter. Okay, let's go to number 3. The short run aggregate supply curve will shift to the right. Okay, so I need something that, remember, if they don't say short run or long run, which aggregate supply curve do they want you to use? Short run. In fact, you can just put aggregate supply. What causes aggregate supply shift to the right? So that'd be something that causes more. Well, something that's good for business. Something that makes it easier to produce goods and services. You can summarize it as more land, labor, capital entrepreneurship or better land, labor, capital entrepreneurship. We can say cheaper land, labor, capital entrepreneurship. More efficient land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship. All right? So is expensive energy going to cause more supply? No. Government regulations to businesses like that say, oh yeah, good for business, yay. No. Prices of inputs being cheaper. Cheaper land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship. That would be it. Investment spending decreases is not going to do it. It might, if they increased investment spending, it might cause them to have more capital. That might increase aggregate supply. Investment is weird. The I component of C, I, G, and X is weird. All the other components just affect demand. The I component affects demand right now, but might affect, because you're building capital, it might affect your supply in the future. Aggregate supply is determined by how much capital. And I is spending money on new capital. All right, productivity rates decrease. That would certainly decrease aggregate supply. Move it to the left. All right, let's go to another one. A rightward shift in the aggregate demand curve with a horizontal aggregate supply curve. Now, that's the kind of a weird part of the aggregate supply curve, but we'll go with it. So, price level, GDP, but the AP test likes to call this output. They might ask you to put a Y here for income. It doesn't matter. Right? So they want a horizontal aggregate supply curve, and then a rightward shift to the aggregate demand curve. They might also just give you a reason to shift it, like more C, more I, more G, more X. Okay, so what happened to price level? Nothing, because it's horizontal there. No change. And then what happened to GDP? Go to the right. So it's increase and then no change. Let's see. By the way, what do we call this horizontal region? Let's go over the regions real quick. What do we call this horizontal region of the aggregate supply curve? Keynesian. Because down here, if aggregate demand was down here, it'd be a recession. That's where Keynes's ideas took hold during the Great Depression. Right? This is the intermediate range, and right there, I always put, that's the full employment amount of GDP, the full employment level of GDP. I put QF. AP test might put GDPF, or just full employment level of GDP. Is that the NRU? 35%? No, because this is not an unemployment axis. You don't put levels of unemployment on here. You don't put 3 to 5% on here. You put amounts of dollars, usually measured in hundreds of billions or trillions. What's this called? Where we only get price level changes. We don't get changes in GDP. That's a classical economics range. Classical economists thought shifts in aggregate demand are only going to affect price level, not GDP. Okay? Let's go to the next one. An increase in the capital stock. What does that mean? This is a great question to me on here. What does that mean? The capital stock. That means how much capital, right? It means how many machines. What's another way? What would cause an increase in this capital stock? If businesses bought more machines, more I. Right? So you might think, well, that's aggregate demand. Well, yeah. But if it causes us to have more machines, it means we're more productive. So more aggregate supply. Let's see. certainly wouldn't move aggregate demand to the left. It wouldn't cause economic contract, like the opposite of economic growth, where the PPC shifts in. Wouldn't cause the Phillips curve to shift out. We'll get to the Phillips curve later. Long run average supply would shift rightward, maybe, because now we're more productive. All right, that would be economic growth. I like D. Consumption function to shift down. You don't have to do a consumption function on this test. So it is D. What does a long run average supply curve look like, by the way? It's perfectly vertical. Where is it perfectly vertical? We don't put NRUs on it. We don't put levels of unemployment on here. It's going to be full employment GDP. The NRU goes under the long run Phillips curve, because that is the level of unemployment. Okay, which of the following is a fiscal policy action? Fiscal policy means two things. It means government spending and taxation. It doesn't mean anything else. By the way, that affects the budget. Which of the following is a fiscal policy action that would increase aggregate demand in the Keynesian model? All the economics you learned was Keynesian except until the very, very end. All right, so if they say in the Keynesian model, they pretty much mean the one you know. Which of the following is a fiscal policy action that would increase aggregate demand? Well, I'll give you, there's only two fiscal policy actions. How do you get G to increase aggregate demand? More G. Aggregate demand is C plus I plus G plus X, so more of that. T is not on the list. C-I-G-X. What does T affect? T affects people's disposable income. This is taxes on households. And that affects people's consumption, how much they buy. So what would you do to taxes to get people to buy more? If you wanted more aggregate demand, we'd cut taxes. People would have more income to spend, more disposable income, and more C. That's an indirect effect, I know. This is weaker than government spending, but it works. So I would cut personal income taxes. You could do A. You could also, you wouldn't cut government spending. You wouldn't increase corporate income taxes. And then what's wrong with these last two? I mean, that was expansionary. That would increase aggregate demand, but what's wrong with this one? The Fed buying government bonds. That's not fiscal policy, that's monetary policy. So that definitely would increase aggregate demand, but that's monetary policy. The answer is A. Right? Alright, an increase in labor productivity. Do you guys care about labor productivity when y'all buy stuff? They're like, man, how productive were the laborers that made this sandwich? Otherwise, I'm not buying it. No! Labor productivity is about production, supply. So, do businesses like better labor productivity? They don't like paying higher wages necessarily, but do they like when their workers are productive? Yes. So, aggregate demand, downward sloping, aggregate supply, price level, GDP. So, I guess that would move aggregate supply to the right. It would increase it. Let me see what happened to real GDP and price level. By the way, is that real or nominal down here? It's real. Real. It doesn't have price level built into it like nominal does, because price level's up here. Real. It's got price level factored out. Put on a different axis. So real GDP increased. Got to be A, B, or C. And price level looks like it went down. By the way, those are both good. Yay. Alright, so I like B. Now you got to be careful though. There's two different ways they can ask you about this axis. They can just say, hey, what happened to output? What happened to GDP? In this case, it's more. Another thing they can say is, what happened to unemployment? What happened to unemployment? Less. That's still good, but it's less. They can ask you questions about unemployment if you know what happened down here. So you got to be careful about what they're asking you about. In this case, they're asking you about GDP. Okay. Number 8 is Maria Escalera's disposable income. This is a question about marginal propensity to consume. Do y'all remember the equation here? MPC is, that's the multiplier is 1 over the MPS. MPC is 1 minus the MPS. But the basic equation for MPC is, hey, if you got some extra money per change in disposable income, if you got some extra money, if your disposable income changed, somebody handed you $5, or let's say $1, or $100, whatever. Somebody hands you $1. If you got some extra money or some taken away, how much would your consumption change? That's MPC right there. your marginal propensity. These deltas make it marginal, these change-ins. Margin is about the change. All right? So if Maria's Escalera's disposable income increased from 600 to 650, so what do we put here? We want the change, so plus 50. The sign is important because it works both ways. Her level of personal consumption expenditures increased from 480 to 520, so it went up 40. What's her MPC? Of this 50 extra bucks she had, on average, how much did she spend? 80 cents of every dollar, 0.8. That's math that you need to be able to do in your brain mind, by the way. MPC is 0.8. What's the MPS? If you know the MPC is 0.8, the MPS and the MPC have to add to 1, so what's it got to be? 0.2. And you can see that she got 50 extra bucks. She only spent 40 of it, so she shaved 10, right? So that is 0.2. Because the MPC equation is simply, okay, when your disposable income changes, how does your saving change? That's right, that's MPS. Okay, let's go to 9. You don't have to do the aggregate expenditures model, so I just changed this to aggregate demand and it still works. This is a question about the multiplier. The spending multiplier. The multiplier that says when a dollar is spent, a little bit gets saved, and the rest is spent. And a little bit gets saved, and the rest of it. How do you know how much gets spent and how much gets saved? Well, the MPC and the MPS tell you. Okay, and let me show you the magic formula. All right, the magic formula for these questions is you take some sort of initial change in spending. It could be up, it could be down, but you take some sort of initial change in spending. What are the 4 types of spending that could be here when they make up the question? Consumer spending, business spending, government spending, foreign spending. C, I, G, or X. It gets multiplied times the multiplier into a big change in GDP. And the multiplier is 1 over the MPS. So, let's do it. The Keynesian aggregate demand model, if the MPC is 0.75, so immediately what's the multiplier? Well, the MPS is 0.25, so what's 1 over that? What's 1 over a fourth? 4, so the multiplier is 4. The change in spending is 6, so 6 times 4 is 24. I got D. Is that what you got? Alright. We're definitely going to get to number, I want to get to 15. We'll see if we can get there before the batteries run out. In the Keynesian demand model, the simple spending multiplier, which is the one there's nothing else you know besides the simple spending multiplier, so don't worry about that. How can you figure it out? Well, we know the magic formula. It's initial change in spending, little change in spending, times the multiplier is big change in GDP. So how can you calculate the multiplier from this guy? Can we divide change in spending to the other side? It'll cancel here and come over here. Could you write it like that? Algebra, anybody who's had Algebra 1, I think, right? Can you write it like that? So I think that's what the answer is. Let's see. The initial change in spending, dividing the initial change in spending by GDP. No, we need the other way around. We need change in GDP divided by the change in spending. So, that one. B. And I was tempted on this guy. I was like, the multiplier is 1 over MPS, which means it's 1 over 1 minus the MPC. So I looked at those other guys to make sure it's not one of those. 1 over 1 minus the MP. Yes, that's not it. 1 over, or 1 by 1 minus the market propensity consumed. Well, 1 plus, yeah. 1 plus is 1 minus. And then the propensity to save by the propensity to consume, that's not it. Sorry to disappoint. All right, which of the following will cause consumption to increase? Remember, we have 4 things that increase consumption. People just get richer. Now, there's a difference between your income goes up, okay, and your wealth goes up. Your wealth is like the things you own become more valuable. Your income goes up means the money you have coming in. Income is money coming in every month, or year, or week, or whatever, goes up. All right. People also can change their consumption because of taxes and expectations. There's one more, I guess I'm forgetting. All right. But it's definitely, to the following will cause consumption to increase. An increase in the amount of consumer indebted. Oh yeah, it's indebtedness. If you're in more debt, you spend less because you got all those debts to pay. If you're in less debt, you spend more. You don't have as many debts to pay. That's the other one. All right. So if you were in more debt, would you spend more? No. If you had less wealth, would you spend more? If you had an expectations of decline in the CPI, would you spend more? What is this? That's a weird way of saying what? What do we call a decline in the CPI? It's not inflation. Inflation is CPI going up, so this would be deflation. Would you spend more now if you knew prices were going to go down? No. An expectation of future shortages of essential consumer goods. Might you spend more now if you thought things won't be available in the future? Gasoline's not going to be available next week. I'm going to buy a bunch now. That's what people do. I like that one. A growing belief that personal income will decline in the future. Do you spend more when you think your income's going to get cut? Or you're going to get fired? No way. People do spend more when they think their income's going to go up. The investment demand curve will shift to the right. Now, this is not a curve that I asked you to know. Okay? And so at first I was like, there's two answers. Let's just ask ourselves, let's change this question slightly. Which one of these will cause more investment? Well, my tattoo says lower interest rates, right? And so I was like, boom, E! I'll tell you why E. They don't want E in a second. But if you put E, you're going to do awesome in the AP test because that's the most important fact to know, is this little relationship. All right? I'll tell you why that's a problem here in a second, but what they're thinking about here. Excess productive capacity. Productive capacity is businesses' capacity to produce. If you have extra factories laying around unused or extra machines laying around unused, do businesses demand more investment? No, they demand less. An increase in corporate business taxes. No, if businesses have to pay more taxes, they can't buy as many machines. Businesses becoming more optimistic about the future would cause them to buy more machines. They're like, yes, we'll invest in more factories because the future is going to be bright. Recessions in foreign nations. Is that good for us when other nations go into a recession? No. That makes them poor.